at this stage, we will take these 1 through 10. We won't do all of them on every one of these. The video will be just way too lengthy. But we will look through some of these and apply them to these example passages. Now, so these passages, all they are, like I said, I don't intend for these to be the best arguments in the world. That's not what I am. That's not the purpose of achieving them. I'm not saying that I buy into any of them or that anybody in here should buy into them. They're just for demonstration purposes. So the first one is, here's something that we might encounter. Is this 3 little sentences. The first sentence is, the weather forecast predicted rain last night. When I walked outside this morning, everything was wet. Thus, it must have rained last night. Well, that's 3 sentences. There's an argument being made there. There are reasons. There's a major claim. So we can go up here and look at step 1, the problem. Like, why were these sentences written or spoken? What was the author or the character's intent? Well, in this case, whoever came up with these, their intent, the problem, like if we do like, so let's do a little bit of this. So if we do like 1, like problem, why would a person say these things? Well, their problem is typically informative. They wanted to inform someone else of why they think it must have rained last night. Inform listener or audience of why she thinks it rained last night. Notice that this is not an ethical moral value conflict. This is not an ethical argument at all. But it does help us work through the steps. These are examples. So the problem is, inform audience of why author of these sentences thinks it rained last night, or why the author. Inform audience of why the author of these sentences thinks it rained last night. That's the intent. That's why these sentences probably exist in our world. I mean, we could be made a mistake. That may not be the exact problem, but it gets us started. And so now, what question is it? Well, the question is very similar to the problem in this case. Question is like, why do I think it rained last night? Why do I think it rained last night? That's good enough. I mean, this is just simple little sentences. We don't have to strain too hard. Now, there could be other motives in there given the context. You know, that it could be that someone right before these sentences were uttered was like, yeah, it hadn't rained in months. And so this person's actually disagreeing. Either way, that's still going to be the same question. Why do I think it rained last night? 3, what is the major claim? What is the conclusion? So this is the answer. Conclusion. Well, what is the conclusion in this passage? How do we find it? Sometimes we have like conclusion indicator words, like typically there are things like thus, therefore, we can conclude that, it must be the case that. You see, those phrases indicate we're reaching a resolution. Thus, therefore, it has to be the case that, it seems to follow that, it must follow that. I'm just giving you examples. I said I would in last week's video. You can look it up on the internet. Just type in conclusion indicator words and you'll find big lists of these things. They tend to be helpful sometimes. Sometimes they're not included. Like in this case, there are no conclusion indicator words except thus. It must have rained last night. That thus is telling us, yep, that's probably the conclusion. That's the answer to the question, see? But we may miss it if we hadn't already thought about the question, like, why do I think it rained last night? It's You may not have gotten that question when you first looked at this passage. I kind of did it quickly, but I mean, I've done this a whole lot. But now it may take everyone in this class longer to figure that out. And if you need a little help, the answer to the conclusion is like, if it's got a thus, a therefore, whatever like that, or if it's the thesis statement, I will argue that, whatever's behind that phrase, I will argue that, that's your conclusion. That should be the conclusion. Authors sometimes make mistakes and think they're defending one sentence when they actually were defending something else. So you see, we're dealing with human. Argumentation is human all day long. So humans make mistakes. We're not perfect. So the idea is this is just a way to try to cut through some of the confusion. That's all we're trying to do. So the answer in conclusion, why do I think it rained last night, is the question. And my answer, or this is even better. Do I think it rained last night? What is the answer? Conclusion, yes. Yes, this person did. Why do I think that? Well, their actual conclusion is, thus, it must have rained last night. That's the conclusion. The next thing is, well, what reasons were offered in support of this conclusion? Well, let's look at the other sentences. So we know this is the conclusion. And if we didn't know that, one way we could have found it is use like the why because method. There is a why because method. You can say, read a sentence and say why, and then see if the next sentence gives you a reason for why, if it answers your why question. So the weather forecast predicted rain last night. Well, why should I believe that? When I walked outside this morning, everything is wet. Well, that's not giving me any support for why the weather forecast predicted what it did. This second sentence does not answer why I should buy into the first sentence. Not even close. So that's not a conclusion. Well, then I can go to the next sentence. When I walked outside this morning, everything was wet. Well, why should I believe the author? Why think that their yard and car was wet? And then read the next sentence. Thus, it must have rained last night. Well, it must have rained last night. That does not give me a reason to believe that when this individual walked outside this morning, everything was wet. The idea is everything is wet. It's like when I walked outside this morning, everything was wet. What's at stake there with the why is I'm asking, why do I believe they walked outside? Well, this doesn't tell me why they walked outside or why I should believe they even went outside. So then we get to the last sentence. Thus, it must have rained last night. Well, why believe that? Because the weather forecast predicted rain last night, and moreover, when I walked outside this morning, everything was wet. That's your reasons. That's how you find them. That's the brute force. You may not have time to brute force every sentence that way, but when you're starting out, you can use the why because method. So use the why because method. Yeah, the why because. That will typically lead you to what you're after. If you can't do anything else, that tends to be a reliable way to do it. That's the why because method. I just gave you a demonstration of it. You go through each sentence, you read a sentence, and you say, why should I believe this? Why do I believe what this sentence is claiming is the case? And then you read the next sentence immediately following it. And if that sentence answers your why question, then you very likely the first sentence was likely a conclusion. It's not a perfect method, but it's a brute force way that if you can't do anything else and you're totally lost, you can use the why because method. It will help you. But in this case, what are the reasons? well, the first reason, so we'll just call it, like, let's say R1. Reason 1, so let's just subdo this. Reason 1 is, and we'll just do this so that everyone can see it. So this will be conclusion. And then reason 1 is the weather forecast predicted rain last night. Yep, and let's fix the typos as is usual. And then the reason 2, yeah, so, and you can summarize this. You don't have to do it word for word. This is not necessarily, you know, I'm just making the complete sentences, but you could do briefer summaries of these. So, so we can just do everything was wet when I walked outside this morning. Just to show people that it doesn't have to be word for word. I mean, so then we have the argument. So we go to over here. So step 5 is we need to collect the arguments. We always collect them. So argument. Remember, an argument is just a set of sentences, one of which is a conclusion, and others in the set are meant to give support for that conclusion. Those are your reasons. So the actual argument is reason 1. And you don't necessarily have to do it this longhand way, the way I'm doing it. But in discussions, you can use like just 1, 2, 3, C or whatever. Or you can just put it in your words, you know, just rearrange everything so people can see, yeah, that was the argument. Yeah, the weather forecast. Well, I'm going to summarize it even more. Rain was predicted. R2. Everything was wet outside. And then the conclusion would be something like, thus it rained last night. Rain was predicted last night. Everything was wet outside this morning. Thus, it rained last night. That's the initial shot at what the argument is in that passage. Well, then the next maneuver is, well, we need to try to understand. Be charitable. Add reasons. Add implied reasons as needed. I'm just putting this in here so that everybody understands that that's what we do in this 6th stage. So we got to think about it. This argument in and of itself is it's really weak. I mean, just kind of taking a quick glance at it, rain was predicted last night. Everything was wet outside this morning, thus it rained last night. What else would this person really need to say to make this a stronger argument? Well, we would have, like, the first reason. No doubt about it. We have to always include, like, let's say this is explicit. That's an explicit reason. Is rain. So we'll do it the same way. So R1, rain was predicted last night. This is explicit, or explicitly stated. Then we have, well, what would make it even stronger? Well, something like weather predictions are, so let's just say, in this case, one could look this data up, that weather predictions tend to be reliable. That's the best we can do in this case. Like, we don't know the actual reliability score, like 80% of the time what the weather people say actually occurs. Maybe it's 50% of the time. We'd have to look at the statistical averaging across it. But that's a claim that this author really kind of needs if this argument's going to be strong. I mean, otherwise, just because rain was predicted, the weather forecast predicted rain, that doesn't really mean anything if we're like, well, the weather forecast is never right. It's always a mess. They rarely, if ever, get anything accurate. So it's like weather predictions tend to be reliable, accurate. That would make this a much, much better argument if I'm being charitable. And remember, that's what we're doing. We're being charitable. We're giving this person kind of what they need to get a stronger argument. As it was, this thing here, this is weak. So we're trying to make it a little stronger. Weather predictions tend to be reliable. So this is an implied, or what's sometimes called suppressed. Implied or suppressed reason. It would make it stronger if it were to be there. And then everything was wet outside this morning. Okay, so we can strengthen that a little bit. Everything was wet outside this morning. This was explicitly stated. Now we'll give them one more just to make it a little more. Well, we may give them two more. Everything was wet outside this morning. Well, rain is the most likely cause of everything being wet outside. That's implied. Yeah, so this is like an implied reason. Yeah, and then we go conclusion. We get down back again. Thus it rained last night. Thus it rained last night. Remember, up here, the original, though, is it must. It must have rained last night. So, thus, it must have rained last night. We need to put that in. Thus, it must have rained last night. That's a charitable rendition. That's what a charitable reading of that argumentation would look like. There's other ways. There's other suppressed or implied things that you could add in there to make it even stronger. But that's good enough for demo purposes. And then this is just a conclusion. I'm just writing these out so everybody can actually see it. The assumption is people may never have seen this done in any day in their life. So let's just make it so it's a little better. We're just going to go with implied reason. And if you're unsure, like, how do I figure out these implied reasons? Well, just look at what's said and think about it. Like, just do a real quick analysis. Like, do I have enough with just reasons 1 and 2 to really give any support at all for this kind of conclusion? Like, an example would be rain was predicted last night. I'm kind of like, okay, well, they predict things all the time. Maybe, who cares? And then just because rain was predicted, I certainly can't go from the claim that rain was predicted to the conclusion that it must have rained. They predict rain sometimes, and it doesn't actually rain. So we can't go from R1 to C. Well, then we do have R2. Everything was wet outside this morning, but everything could have been wet outside this morning because the person's neighbor was playing a prank on them and took a water hose and knows that that person has a little small yard. They live in town, and that person just sprayed water all over their driveway, their car, their grass. And that person never really looked at their other neighbors. They just noticed wet on the ground in their yard. And so it helps. So what would make that better so we could actually maybe buy into the conclusion was if we add in that weather predictions tend to be reliable or accurate. And then moreover, the rain's the most likely cause of everything being wet outside. Because how often is your neighbor really going to play that kind of prank? And so you see, if we give them those, if we give the speaker those, and that's not giving them a whole lot. That's just giving them the bare minimum of what they need to get to a conclusion that seems like there may be plausibility. Now we analyze. Analyze. And I've already said this out, so the idea is this argument plausible? It can't be deductive necessity. Even if I assumed all four of these were true, it's still not going to force that to be true. An example would be, let's assume rain was predicted, assume that weather predictions tend to be reliable and accurate. Everything was wet outside this morning. Let's assume that's true. And let's assume that rain is the most likely cause of everything being wet outside. And what I mean by assuming is imagine that this is true. Now, must it be the case that it actually rained last night? No. None of that forces this sentence down here to actually be true, in that rain was predicted and weather predictions tend to be reliable and accurate, but they could be inaccurate at times. That means this premise could be false. So there's no way this is valid. So the best this argument can do is it may be plausible though, that if I assume rain was predicted last night and that weather predictions tend to be reliable and accurate, that everything was in fact wet outside this morning and that rain's the most likely cause of everything being wet, well, yeah, it seems plausible. I mean, we would buy into that. So we can analyze it and say, boom, yeah, seems plausible. And what we mean by that is, so here we go. When I assume R1 through R4 is true, then C seems likely true. Let's analyze it. I mean, a person needs a plausible argument at the minimum. I mean, it doesn't have to be valid, but it's got to be, it's got to be plausible at minimum. So then, well, what do? We go to the next thing. Are the reasons actually true? We ask that, ask the soundness. Well, I said this wrong. What we were doing here, is the argument cogent? Sorry. Yeah, seems cogent. Cogent. Yeah, that's cogent. Then we ask the soundness and plausible question. Ask the soundness plausible question. Namely, are those premises actually true in the real world? Was rain actually predicted last night? Weather predictions, do they actually tend to be reliable and accurate? Everything was wet outside this morning. Do I believe the speaker? They're just giving me a verbal report. So do I believe them? And rain is the most likely cause of everything being wet outside. Is that actually true in our world? Was this person actually telling me the truth? is rain the most likely cause? Every one of those could be true or false. So ask the soundness and is this argument plausible? The answer could be. It could be. That's the best we can do at this moment. We don't know. I mean, this is just sentences were thrown at us, so we don't have access to verify this. So the best we can say is, well, it could be. Maybe. Could be. Maybe. That's the best we can do. But in real world arguments like these, this is just a made up argument. But in a real world argument, if I'm looking like at a scientific experiment or something, I can actually go back and do the same experiments. And so I may be able to say, is this plausible? I may be able to say, yes, it is. But now, when would it not be plausible? Well, if we give people, and we are as charitable as we can be, and yet it's still likely that one of their reasons is actually false in the real world, then it's not. No, it's not plausible. See, the plausibility and soundness questions are asking, is the reasons actually true? Or are they very likely true? Okay? We could say more about this, but we have other examples that we want to get to. But this gives us so we analyzed it. Now we make a decision. Yeah. So do I buy the argument? Do I buy it? Well, without being able to do this could be, what I would say is my decision is more information is needed before I buy it. And then, well, I need reasons. More information is needed before I buy it. More information is needed. For example, let's see, I would need the actual forecast for the night in question. I would need that I would need to know the accuracy and reliability scores of weather forecasts in the area. And we could do that. I mean, there are numbers that people in here may not yet have encountered statistics classes or inductive logic classes. But the idea is, yeah, we have reliability scores. Engineers do them all the time. And we have accuracy scores. Like engineering is filled with accuracy and reliability scores, and most any science is. Any science will be filled with these things. And so we can actually measure the reliability or the accuracy of a technique, of a tool, of a program. And when they're doing weather forecasts, it's based off of the software and the historical patterns, the statistics of how well have our forecasts, our forecast data, how well is it correlated with the actual data. And so you can find those. But I would need those before I'd be able to buy in. And then things like everything was wet outside this morning, I would need more evidence that everything was wet that particular morning. Like a picture, video, etc. I would need more data before I could believe that is true. And then 4, Rain is the most likely cause of everything being wet outside. Well, I would need, rain was the most likely cause of everything being wet outside. I would need, some data to support the claim that everything being wet outside was most likely caused by a rain, or caused by rain. That would be very, very difficult. I mean, we kind of intuitively kind of would accept it, but to get an actual score on that, we would have to do some science, and maybe there is some out there on that. But this is just a decision. So what are these? What have I been generating? And I've been writing them just as they come to my head. So, like, do I buy the argument? No. More information is needed before I buy it. Why? Because now we fix it. Because more information is needed. For example, I would need the actual rain forecast for the night in question. I would need to know the accuracy and reliability scores of weather forecasts in the area. I would need more evidence that everything was wet that particular morning. I would need some data to support the claim that everything being wet outside was most likely caused by rain. And that is my counter argument. See, I've generated a counter argument. Like, the idea is, if someone says, like, do you agree with this argument? Do I buy the argument? Do I agree or disagree with the argument? No, that's my claim. That's my conclusion. No, I don't agree. Why? Well, because I need more information, the actual forecast, and that for the night in question, I need to know the actual reliability scores. Oh, no, see, so do I buy in? No, I don't buy in. Now, but I could say, well, can I make this even stronger? You see, you can always keep trying to strengthen, and you could go and try to find this information and see. And if you got the data you requested, well, then this argument becomes stronger and stronger. But what you do is you start inserting more and more and more data. You get more and more reasons. You insert your answers you find to these back into it. And then 9 is the results. In this case, I'm sharing it with you folks. So the results is, well, whatever you folks happen to think about this argument, and then the share. So in this case, I'm going to leave these open so that y'all can think about it. Yeah, so what does the audience watching this video think? And that would be, what do you think about the way it's been laid out? Like, was I unfair in some kind of way to the person who made this argument? Like, was I fair in restating this argument? Was I charitable enough? Was I charitable enough? That's the sort of results I would want to know. Yeah, and then, I share it. I've already shared it. Yeah. This video shares my findings and analysis. That's it. We did it. 1 through 10 on that argument. That's how involved it is, even with something simple. Now, where you have to, you see it takes time. Obviously, this video is still going, and I've been talking quite a while. But the idea is this gives a person the long way of doing it. You get to see it all at one time in this video. This is the way, though, if you really want to understand a passage that contains argumentation, this is how you do it. This is the technique. Obviously, we won't always be able to, like I said, this is the slow way to do it, but I hope everyone's able to see that I've gained a whole lot more out of those 3 sentences than just 3 sentences. This is what philosophy people do. This is what lawyers do. This is what anybody that deals with argumentation, they may not do it in exactly these same steps in exactly the same order, but this is the pattern of analyzing arguments in whatever form they show up in. This is the technique. Yeah. So that's the way it works. Let's look through another one. We will look through, say, maybe one more in this video, and there are many, many more. All we should have to do is maybe look through one more, like this one should do. This one's, yeah, this is a good one. This is standard, and it's so interesting the way these things work. So here's the passage, so we don't, yeah, so let's flag this for everybody so that they know. Applying the philosophical pattern of inquiry to the passage. Whoops. Let's underline it so everyone can see it. Yep. And we'll actually label it passage 1. Applying this pattern to, so everyone is aware of it. Yeah. Example passages, there's passage 1, there's the pattern applied to it. Yeah. Now, the next thing is the next passage. Let's label it, drop it to another page so that everybody can actually see it. Okay, so passage 2. And then this will be passage 3 on down the line. I'll update this with these numbers as, before I post it to the class. But let's just work through this one more time. With we could pick passage 2. It's an interesting one. But let's maybe do one that's obviously like ethical, moral. Let's just do passage 4. Passage 4 is, well, I don't know. Let's just keep looking. I got lots of passages. Yeah, this one works. We'll do passage 5. It's kind of big, but it's got an actual value conflict in it. So some of these others we would have to do a lot of. I'm trying to keep this video as brief as I can for everybody, but going through passage 5, by the time we work through that, I think everybody will they'll have a sense of how this works. So what are we going to do? We're going to applying the philosophical pattern of inquiry to passage 5. That's what we are to do right now. So we need to start with step 1. We're looking for a problem. My suspicion with a passage like this in this scenario, given that, I created it, I mean, it's based on something that one of my neighbors said to me, a few months back. And I thought it was really interesting, and so it's in the class. But it's just every day. This is how value conflicts arise. So let's read the passage. We'll read it first. The passage says states, which like South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, wherever, the states should set stricter limits on how tax dollars are spent by primary schools. Recently, I took a tour of my kids' school and noticed that every classroom was fully equipped with new electronic blackboards, or Promethean boards is what they're sometimes called, fancy computers and tablets. Not once has my child mentioned that the teachers actually used all of the fancy equipment. Moreover, at the first of the year, the school was adamant and required that parents provide their kids with pencils, paper, textbooks, markers, crayons, paper towels, construction paper, and for little kids, diapers, etc., etc. Close to $100+ in supplies. If the school hadn't been allowed to blow all their money on technology that primary school kids, I mean, we're talking about like kindergarten to about the 5th grade, so that primary school kids don't really even need nor truly appreciate, then they wouldn't have had to demand that parents provide their kids with crayons and construction paper. Really? Primary school kids always provided crayons and construction paper when I was in school. So people, everyone in this class may have heard something like this before. I heard it from a neighbor. This isn't the neighbor's exact words, but this was this is the sort of claims and the reasoning that was provided by a neighbor. So a real person said these things. I've just refined it, made it into a passage format. I froze in time the gist of what the person was saying, like the overall sense of it. Well, so what is the problem? Well, just looking at this, it may not be immediately obvious to everyone in this class. I don't expect it to be. But if we just stop and think for a minute, why did my neighbor offer this? So the question we're asking is, why did my neighbor say these things? What was the motivation? What was his motivation? What seems to be the moral, ethical, value conflict in play? And there is one in play in this. There's a practical value conflict in play, but there's also something that's quite moral if we think about it. And I'm just going to work through this kind of quickly so that people see it. But what it seems to be, what is in conflict? Like, what two or more values may be in conflict? What values seem to be in conflict in this passage? An answer to that would be, it would seem that my neighbor values, it could be a lot of things, but the suspicion is that the neighbor values kids being provided with the basics of education. That my neighbor assumes that you don't necessarily have to have electronic blackboards, fancy computers, and tablets in order to get a good education at a primary school level. That good education does not require all of those technological gadgets. And why would we maybe think that? Because primary school kids always provided primary schools always provided crayons and construction paper when I was in school, and just the connotation of this with, my neighbor, I also know the person, so that's contextual, factor that I'm giving everyone to consider, is that this person would consider good education not to have required that parents buy all of this stuff. That good education could be supplied. The school could take the tax dollars, buy the minimum like chalk and an actual chalkboard, and education could still occur. Perfectly acceptable education, like my neighbor would think he had. And then that's the neighbor's thing, is then my neighbor values good education, but then he's perceiving the school as maybe having a different notion of good education. So the actual value conflict is a conflict between one person's understanding of what's needed for a good education versus the assumption versus my neighbor's assumed. All right, so how do we say this? It's something like my neighbor thinks that the school's behavior of what they're spending tax dollars on is not conducive to promoting, that it's getting in the way of what might be, required for a good education. So what kind of values do we want to say are in conflict? But it's what my neighbor perceives the schools as valuing in regards to education. The neighbor doesn't necessarily know what the school as an entire entity actually thinks it's doing by buying all this technology. The neighbor doesn't know that. But the neighbor is projecting a value or projecting the way a school is trying to achieve that value. It's complicated, needless to say. But it's a conflict between, we'll just make it simple, between one actual value and one assumed or projected value. And this one is one actual value of what's needed for a good education. The value is good education. And the assumed projected value, how these schools, the school's understanding of a good education as evidenced by their recent purchasing behavior and parental requests. That's crunchy, but that's getting closer to what's there. Like I said, actually articulating the problem that's underlying things, value conflicts, it's not always easy. But maybe that'll do for us. It's conflict between one actual value, like my neighbor's value, of what's needed for a good education. So this is neighbor's understanding of what's needed for a good education, or neighbors' understanding of what's needed for a good education, and one assumed a projected value. The school's understanding of a good education as evidenced by their recent purchasing behavior and parental request. And parental request is that stuff for pencils, papers, and whatever. People in the, everyone watching this video, you can do a better job at getting the value if you want to, and we may be able to do better after we work through the other steps. So the question, okay, so what question does this passage, what is it trying to answer? Well, we go to the first sentence, like states should set stricter limits on how tax dollars are spent by primary schools. Everyone in this class reading this passage for the first time may or may not see that that's really what's at stake. But if you went through like the answer to the question and then you get to looking for a conclusion, ultimately you'll find that that's the most likely candidate. You can hammer through this with the why because method. And if you do that just on the first sentence, states should set stricter limits on how tax dollars are spent by primary schools. Why? Well, because, and then you read through all this and you'll find that every bit of all of these sentences are in some way trying to give support to that claim. There's your answer right there, your conclusion or your thesis. And so the idea is the question is, well, it's just going to question the should states. Okay, so should states set stricter limits on primary school spending? That's the question. Should states set stricter limits on primary school spending? And we can make that more ethical and moral. We can go through this like, given that we're dealing with a value of what counts as good education, well, kids can be harmed and hurt later in life if they have a poor education. Or, that's what is a common thought. May or may not be true, but the idea is this thing has like all the makings of a moral conflict in that education, anytime we talk about education, especially when it involves children, the value is everybody values good education, but what happens is there's different interpretations. Or people say, well, look at what this institution is doing, and that in their mind does not map on to what is required for a good education to actually occur, and so it looks like wasteful spending. And then they say, well, maybe the state should rein in that spending. So the question, should states set stricter limits on primary school spending? And then you can even add, so as to ensure, not unsure, ensure a good education is provided. So as to ensure that a good education is provided. That lets you see that the question does absolutely relate to the problem. This passage is going to provide an answer to this question, my neighbor's answer, or, an answer akin to what my neighbor was up to. And this, and like I said, this analysis, it doesn't have to be perfect. All we're trying to do is to gain a better understanding of what's going on in here so that we can decide for ourselves. My neighbor could look at this and say, no, that isn't what I was thinking at all. We can't help that. That's on the neighbor to come back and tell us if we get our analysis messed up or we get our process messed up. If we missed it, we made a mistake. But all we can do as people reading these words is take the context and try to make some sense, some reasonable approximation of what was going on. And so, question, should states set stricter limits on primary school spending? My neighbor's answer, yes. Yes. So this is the conclusion. States should set stricter limits on primary school spending. That is the core claim that has to be defended in a passage like this. Now we go to the reasons. So why buy into this? Why? Well, reason one. There's a lot of words here, but this is why I picked this example. Is just because there's a lot of words in a passage, it doesn't mean you have to include all of them. All you have to capture with reasons is the sense of what's going on, and you have to be accurate. But let's think about this. Let's read some of these. Recently, I took a tour of my kid's school and noticed that every classroom was full of essentially a lot of electronic equipment. Not once has my child mentioned that the teachers actually used all of the fancy equipment. Okay, so the first reason is going to be something like, states should set stricter limits on primary school spending. Well, why? Why should they do that? Because let's see, it's going to be something like, what is the reason states should do that? It's going to be examples of lots of electronic gear in classrooms that seems unused and not able to be appreciated by primary school age kids. That's the reason. Is the neighbors saying states should set stricter limits on primary school spending. Why? Well, because there's many examples of these classrooms that are filled with tons of electronic gadgets that seem to go unused and maybe not even possible to be appreciated by somebody that's 5 years old. I mean, to really understand and gain the value of it being there. So examples of lots of electronic gear in classrooms that seems unused and not able to be appreciated by primary school age kids. So the state, so that, and then I'm just trying to get the reasons, so that'd be one reason. Another reason would be what? Let's see if we can find another one in this. Okay, so painful. So this would be financially painful demands placed on parents. Yeah, so unnecessarily painful. Yeah, unnecessary. Nah, it'll be good enough. Financially painful demands placed on parents. That's another reason that's in here. But it is that they're unneeded. Yeah, so unneeded and financially painful demands are being placed on parents. So the idea there is that the school requires that parents spend all this money to provide all these supplies, but that requirement would not be needed. That painful requirement to some people would not be needed if the school was not filling classrooms full of electronic stuff. And so why should states set stricter limits? Well, because schools are squandering their money. Okay, so now school, yeah, primary schools are squandering money on unneeded and unappreciated techno gadgets. There we go. So now we can pull this out. See, this is the process. I am not doing this like if someone's like, woo, this is rough to have to sit here and do all this. Yes, it is. It takes thought. But keep in mind, the more one does it, the quicker they get at it. They become quicker, they become more efficient. And I've done it a lot, but I've never sat and done it on this particular passage. I wanted to show everyone the real experience of encountering it for the first time. So primary schools are squandering money on unneeded and unappreciated techno gadgets. Unappreciated. And remember, with the unappreciated, what is meant by that is that the kids aren't even capable of understanding it or appreciating it like to be able to get true educational value out of it. Like real, tangible, like do we really need a $100 tablet in order to learn our colors and animals and things like that? Or would the old standard just printed cardboard things be perfectly okay? It wouldn't just Polaroid pictures of a bear and you put it up there and let kids see, here's a bear. And wouldn't that do just as well? Maybe not. Do they really gain like some extraordinary advancement in what they're learning just because it can be digitally projected on a screen rather than a standard little picture, that can be passed around or set on the front of a chalkboard in the front of the classroom? Yeah. And so that's good. Yeah, that's a good summary. Reason 2, unneeded and financially painful demands are, unnecessary. There we go. I knew I wanted to say, because that's a connotation. Unnecessary and financially painful demands are being placed on parents. And so we need to fill that in. The idea is, having to buy all of these supplies would not be necessary if the school had money to do that themselves, which they do, but they're spending it on the electronic stuff, so parents have to foot the bill for that. The parents have to make up getting the basics in order to make up for the school spending it on the non-essentials. Are being placed on parents. Yeah. Parents are being required to supply the necessities for a good education, while schools are being allowed to buy non-necessities for a good education. That'll be another reason. But that's kind of all tied into R2 there. I'm just going to put it in here so that it may be relevant, in our figuring all this out. Parents are being required to supply the necessities for a good education, while schools are being allowed to buy non-necessities, to waste tax dollars on non-necessities for a good education. Yeah. And so now, once we've done this, parents are being required to supply the necessities for a good education, while schools are being allowed to waste tax dollars on. So, in fact, what we can do, this happens. This is a dynamic process. We'll just get rid of all of these. We'll just use this as our one reason. if you're shaking your head and you're a little frustrated seeing this process, it's just the nature of the process. I mean, I cannot do any, I can't make the process less painful than it may be. Parents are being required to supply the necessities for a good education while schools are being allowed to waste tax dollars on non-necessities for a good education. And that actually captures most of what's going on in there. I mean, there are other reasons we could generate, like the child says that, but the idea is the child reports that none of this fancy equipment's being used. Well, that would imply that it's non-necessary. If it's never used, it's non-necessary. So we captured that sentence. That I took a tour of my kid's school and noticed. So this that every classroom's filled with the electronic stuff. Well, the idea is that would be a reason in that we do have a first person. Yeah, so R2 would be we have first person observation of classrooms filled with lots of techno gadgets. So that is a reason. We would need to include that. Not once has my child mentioned it. Moreover, the first year it did all of these supplies. And then the neighbors, like primary schools, they always provided these things when I was in school. So that is a reason we would want to include is like, so here we go. That supports really, it's sort of a sub reason for this. It's that, so this is like, I mean, you don't have to do it this way. We won't do it this way. We'll just, but it adds support to reason 1. So let's just say this is reason 2. And it's going to be something like, it will be something like, there's at least some evidence that techno gadgets are not necessary for securing a good education, for securing a good primary school level education. Yeah, that'll be good enough. And everyone in here, if you can figure out a way to make these more concise, by all means do it. I mean, I'm doing it on the fly on a video. I'm doing what I can. So just to give everybody a sense of how the process works. So let's see. Now we need to generate the actual argument. Now that we have all the pieces. Argument. Well, reason, and we can reorder some of these reasons if we need to. Yeah, it would probably be better, but we'll do it. We'll just leave it as it is. R1. And let's see if we can be a little more concise if we can. Parents are being required to supply the necessities for a good education while schools are being allowed to waste tax dollars on non-necessity for a good education. Okay, reason 1, and we're just trying to reduce the words. Parents required to supply necessities for a good EDU. Schools now let's see. Parents, well, instead of sitting here and playing with it, what we'll do is just copy paste. It's good enough. I mean, we worked hard to get these 3 sentences, so let's just take them with us. We will copy and we'll paste. Paste. Okay. So at least we have all of them. Okay, parents are being required to supply the necessities for a good education while schools are being allowed to waste tax dollars on non-necessities for a good education. There's at least some evidence, meaning my neighbor's thing that my parents didn't have to supply crayons and construction paper. That is at least some evidence that techno gadgets are not necessary for securing a good primary school level education. And then the first person observation of classrooms filled with lots of techno gadgets. And then all we need is the conclusion. And then we just go back up to 3. States should set stricter limits on primary school spending. States should set stricter limits on primary school spending. All right, there is the argument. It's good enough. We're going to have, we will need to add more to it in this next step. So if you say, whoa, there's more under there, well, fine. We need to try to understand. Let's add what we need to it. Understand, remember, we're trying to be charitable. We add any implicit things we think we need. So at this point, we can just copy, paste again. Copy, paste again. Edit, copy. And then paste. Now, can we make this a stronger argument? Parents are required to supply the necessities for a good education while schools are being allowed to waste tax dollars on non-necessities for a good education. There's at least some evidence that techno gadgets are not necessary for securing a good primary school level education. Then we have a first person observation of classrooms filled with lots of techno gadgets. The state should set stricter limits on primary school spending. What would make this an even stronger argument is if we had some definition of what a good education actually requires and what's necessary for it. But I'll leave the audience to think, do we need any more implicit reasons to really get from these sentences down to that? States should set stricter limits on primary school spending. Yeah, we do need one. R4. It's the states. Yeah, here we go. States are responsible for ensuring that good education is being provided by schools within the state. Yeah, so states are responsible for ensuring that good education is being provided by schools within the state. Otherwise, why in the world how would we ever get down to the sentence about states should set stricter limits on primary school spending? This has to be there. This is implied reason. I mean, that is the only way I can see that we might preserve the truth. Like I mentioned earlier, the idea is you try to preserve the truth. You try to say, if this sentence is true, could I get from here to there? And keeping both of them true at the same time. So parents will be required to supply necessities for a good education while schools are being allowed to waste tax dollars on non-necessities for a good education. If we had a notion of good education that everybody could agree on, the value that's actually in conflict here, we could add that in here as an implied reason. But we don't really have any We do have some sense that a good education may not require technology stuff, but that's just a claim made by my neighbor. We don't really have any evidence that we can just give right here. So there's at least some evidence that techno gadgets are not necessary for securing a good primary school level education. That's all we have. That's like a single neighbor that implies that. See, in many ways, this is an implied reason. I mean, really, it is. It's being extracted from the context and the last sentence of the passage right here. Primary schools always provided crayons and construction paper when I was in school, and that carries forward as so those things aren't necessary for a good education. But we've kind of included it in there, so we don't need to add another one there. And then states are responsible for ensuring that a good education is being provided by schools within that are within the states. Okay? I mean, obviously we're talking about a public school system here. We're not talking about private. And then states should set stricter limits on primary school spending. Yeah, the implied reason is they're responsible to do it, so they should be doing something about it. Yeah, that's good enough. I mean, I feel like people watching this video, I mean, think about these reasons and say, is anything else needed to be charitable to the sort of message or what the point that my neighbor was trying to make? That's what you're trying to do. You assume that the author or the person who provides you with these sentences, with all these claims and statements, is an intelligent person. And then they're honest. They're trying to be honest with you. And all you're trying to do when you're being like down here and understanding is you're just trying to generate a thing that if my neighbor were to read this would say, yeah, that's what I had in mind. That's all you're trying to do during stage 6. I think it's good enough for our purposes. So the next step 7, is decision or analysis. Oh, we need to analyze. Okay, so is this argument valid? If I assume that A, B, C, D, like reason 1, 2, 3, and 4, if I assume they are true, must that be true? So if it's true that parents are being required to spend a whole bunch of money on things that are necessary for good education, and schools are being allowed to, and schools are actually wasting dollars on the non-necessity for a good education, if I assume that's true, and that this evidence is, there is some evidence that maybe super duper technology gadgets are not needed for a good education. Well, let's assume those are true. Maybe they are true. Let's just assume they are. Then the first person observation of a classroom filled with lots of gadgets. Well, yeah, why not? We'll assume that my neighbor actually did see classrooms filled with that stuff. That's not unbelievable by any means. And then states are responsible for ensuring that good education is being provided by schools within the states. Well, I mean, a lot of people would say that's true. And that the states may very well, if we look at the laws of the state responsibilities relative to the particular state, my neighbor's referring to, that could very well be under the responsibility of the state government. Yeah, state. And so what we mean by state is kind of like state government. So state governments are responsible for ensuring that good education is being provided by the schools that are within the states. Provided by schools within the states. Provided by schools within the states. And states should set stricter limits on primary school spending. What we mean there is state governments should. So that's okay. I've said it in the video. There's no reason to add it back in there. And so the idea is, if I assume all these are true, must this be true? Well, no. It doesn't have to be. I mean, there may be that states The question is, must this sentence be true if all of these are true? States should do something. It doesn't have to be. Why? Well, because there may be other ways to achieve, like, even if this is true, like schools are wasting the money and techno gadgets aren't really necessary to achieve the goal, and that states are actually responsible for ensuring good education. So should the states set strict limits? They may not need to set stricter limits on primary school spending. They may be able to achieve this in a different kind of way. It's like, why couldn't they give more money to primary schools? There you go. That's how you know that an argument's not valid. Is if you can think of another conclusion that's the exact opposite in many ways of what the actual conclusion is. So, why wouldn't all of these sentences be just as good of reasons to support the claim that states should actually increase spending on primary school education to compensate for schools spending money on non-necessities? Why don't we just throw more money at the problem? I'm sorry. It's just. I'm sure people who watch television on a given day with the news would understand. Yeah, some ways you can restrict the money going into a state institution, or you can just throw more money at the state institution. Typically it goes that way. So, do these things force this sentence to be true? No, because this sentence may or may not be true. Well, these sentences don't make it true. That they should do something. They should maybe do something else. So this sentence is not strictly forced to be true. That means the argument's not valid, but is it cogent? Do these reasons, if we are assuming they're true, make this at least plausible? Yeah, sure they do. So analyze, is this argument valid? No. And why no? No, because assuming R1 through R4 are true does not force C to be true. And I've just talked through that. Why doesn't it force it? Is because I could just as easily substitute states should throw more money at it, and every one of those reasons would get me to that conclusion just as easy as they would this conclusion. That all of these could be reasons for the opposite. Instead of setting stricter limits, they should open the floodgates of even more money, pull limits that are currently there off. A person could use all of those reasons to support the contrary to that. So it's not valid. No, because assuming are true, assuming does not force C to be true. But now the next thing is, okay, is this argument cogent? Yes, it's plausible to think that if R1 through R4 were true, then C could also be true. Could also, or is likely to be true. You got to kind of think about that. But yeah, it's plausible to think that if R1 through R4 are true, then C, it could also be true. Sure, it could be. It could be. And that's all cogency is good. There's no contradiction here. That if all these are true, C could certainly still be true. C is consistent Cogency is typically like consistency. If all these were true, could this also be true? Is it likely to be true? Well, it could be. Yeah, sure. Is this argument cogent? So let's say consistent at the very least. Yes. It's plausible to think that R1 through R4, if those were true, then C could also be true. It could. Yeah, sure. It may not be, but it could be. So now the idea is are the reasons actually, come on, actually true, or likely? Are the reasons actually true or likely? Well, parents are being required to supply the necessities for a good education. That, we may have to have some debate about that. That what we run into at this point, when we're analyzing it right here, that's a big claim, R1. Parents are being required to supply the necessities for a good education, while schools are being allowed to waste tax dollars on non-necessities for a good education. We have some evidence. I mean, what we're doing at this point, where this is like soundness, plausibility, yeah, so we're asking, is the argument sound plausible? And at this point, are the reasons actually true? That's our question. Are they actually true or likely true? That's where a whole lot of debate's going to have to take place. At the moment, this argument, even when we have put it and we added an implied reason, we built it as strong as the information we were given allows. Like my neighbor in this passage, we are not told exactly what a good education involves. We have nothing to tell us that. We have some implication that it doesn't necessarily involve technological gadgets. We have evidence for that, but we don't have evidence for what it actually requires. We have some indication of what it may not require, but we don't have an indication of what it actually would require. So we don't have is the argument sound or plausible? Are the reasons actually likely true? It could be that first reason might be false. Now, what about reason 2? There's at least some evidence that techno gadgets are not necessary for securing a good primary school education. Well, the evidence we have is that one person, namely my neighbor, thinks that it's not necessary. That's our evidence. We have a first-person report. My neighbor assumed the neighbor's an intelligent person, is able to reason and think. Well, that person, an educated person, thinks it's not necessary. So that's at least one data point that it's not necessary. That's why I put at least some. Keep in mind that phrase at least some just means we have at least one. And if we may want to do that, we have at least one piece of evidence. If we were being real specific about it, namely the neighbor's, view of it. But does that seem like we could find truth there? There's at least some evidence. Well, yeah, it would be true because my neighbor serves as evidence. So yes, reason 2 is very likely true. My neighbor is giving one piece of evidence, namely his opinion that they're not technological stuff's not necessary. And I would be willing to wager there are other people besides just my neighbor. I mean, people in this class can think about this, but I would think there's more than one person that would think this way. So yeah, reason 2 is probably true. There's at least one piece of evidence. That don't mean it's a good piece of evidence. It doesn't mean that it's a defeater, like one piece is enough to knock over everything. By no means, but it does mean that there's at least one piece of evidence, one opinion of an educated person. So, first person observation of classrooms filled with lots of technical gadgets. Yeah, I mean, that's probably true. Why would we wonder? I mean, the neighbors said they went and saw the classrooms filled with these things. We could actually verify it ourselves. Yeah, so R3, yeah, could very well be true. R4, state governments are responsible for ensuring that good education is being provided by schools within the states. That was an implied reason, but it was necessary, remember, to get to a conclusion. If there's a soundness or plausibility concern about this argument, it's with R1 and R4. That state governments are responsible for ensuring that good education is being provided by schools within the states. This could be true, but it depends on what we mean by the notion of a good education. Remember, it's the value, good education, that's murky in this. And that's why I wanted us to analyze this particular passage. There's other passages, obviously that I've included in this, but this one's a good one of just the murkiness of ethical, moral value conflicts. Is that a person, we have an argument here. We have it. We picked out the value. We know there's a conflict potentially between a perceived value based on what the school is doing versus what the school thinks is necessary for good education versus what my neighbor seems to think is necessary. But now the neighbor didn't ask the school. My neighbor just has manufactured what he thinks they think based off of his observations. And that may sound kind of convoluted, but that's normal. Think about how many times in life people do that. Is we may not ask a person or an institution what their actual position is on something. We just assume based on what we observe from them that, oh yeah, what they're doing indicates this is the way they understand that value. And so we say, well, that understanding seems different than our own perception of the value. And so then we disagree. But what we are disagreeing with is we are disagreeing what we think they think. Keep that in mind. What we think they think, or what we think they believe. We are attributing it in many cases rather than they actually telling us. This is a case every day. Oh, so common. I'm not saying this is good or this is bad. I'm just saying this is something to realize very quickly with ethical, moral disagreements, is that many times these disagreements or these conflicts are arising not because one person says, I think abortion's awful, and another person thinks, I think abortion's wonderful. It's not that. It is that. We're going to see plenty of examples of it. But what it also is, just as many times in our everyday life, is one person thinks abortion's awful. They think that based on what someone else has said, that person thinks abortion might be okay. And then they disagree with what they think that other person thinks. But they may not directly ask the person, well, what do you actually think about abortion? Instead, they make an assumption about what that other individual is thinking. Think about how that makes the argument very weak. That's what I'm getting to. This is a weak argument. It need not be. Given the information we have, is this argument sound or plausible? Are the reasons actually or likely true? R1 and R2 could very well be false. R1 and R4. R1 and R4 could very well be false. R2 and R3 could be are likely true. Yeah, because it's likely true that, well, I mean, it very much probably it is true that if one person thinks that techno gadgets are not necessary for a good education at primary school level, then there is some evidence. So R2 is true. R3, first person observation of classrooms filled with lots of techno gadgets. Yeah, I mean, my neighbor very likely went in there. Why wouldn't he? You know, so R2, 3, they're both likely true. But R1 and R4, they could very well be false depending on what we mean by good education. Okay, so that is the analysis. So what is the result of this? What happens when you end up like this? Is the argument sound? Argument is not necessarily sound nor necessarily plausible. All right, that's good enough. At this point, now we make a decision. Do we agree, or like, here we go, I'll just do it for me. Do I agree with neighbor's argument? So let's start out even simpler though. Do I buy it? Do I buy what my neighbor's selling? That's the questions you ask at the decision point. Do I buy it? Do I agree with my neighbor, with my neighbor's argument? Oops. Let's get that straight. No. Why? Why? Because the value of because there's significant ambiguity about what actually counts as a good education. And this argument does not clarify or does not provide enough information to remedy the ambiguity. And what does that mean? That means that the only way reason one is true is if we understand what a good education is. If we don't agree on that value and the way it's interpreted, reason one may or may not be true. We cannot assess reason one until we have some set of criteria of what counts as a good education. There's no way. We cannot assess this. So that's what this means is, do I buy it? No, I don't buy this argument. Why? Well, because there's significant ambiguity about what actually counts as a good education. And I think everybody watching this video could agree that different people will interpret good education differently. Good versus bad education. Like what is involved in a primary age school kid actually receiving a good education. I mean, there could be lots of things. Some people may think that technology is necessary because we live in a highly technological world. Some people may think it's not necessary because they went to school at a time when the internet didn't exist, like I did. The internet did not exist when I was in primary school. It didn't exist for perhaps quite a few people in this class. And the idea is, our education was good enough so that we were able to go forth in life and get jobs and survive and have families of our own. So if that's all it takes for an education to be good is just to be able, this person's able to adequately make their way in society as a productive citizen after having been through the education, And if contemporary techno gadgets are not necessary to achieve that, well, then this could be true. But the idea is this: the author of these sentences, my neighbor, never defined what good education is. All he did was imply it. So we cannot, or I cannot, buy this argument until I know more about what the concept of good education or the value of good education my neighbor is assuming. I need more than just these words. So no, why? Because there's significant ambiguity about what actually counts as good education, and this argument does not provide enough information to remedy the ambiguity. Remedy this ambiguity. Yeah, this ambiguity. A list of criteria, standards, definition, etc. of the notion of what counts as a good education is needed before I would be willing to accept this argument as plausible. It's not plausible to me until I know more about what my neighbor had in mind about what counts as a good education. State governments are responsible for ensuring that good education is being provided by schools within the states. That could be false. It depends on how, they're responsible for ensuring that good education. Once again, this is going to apply to that. That notion of good education, that value floating around in there, until we're real clear about what that means, no, I wouldn't buy in. Okay, that's good enough. I have said, do I agree? No. And I've given one reason, or actually, I give a reason and talk through it and say it in two different ways. These are my reasons for why I wouldn't necessarily buy in. And where do those reasons come from? Well, they're based off of the analysis. See, I found it right here in step 7 that are the reasons actually, R1 and R2 are could very well be false. And so which reasons do I disagree with? Notice, I'm not disagreeing with the conclusion. States should set stricter limits on primary school spending. That may or may not still be true. I don't know. All I'm saying is that these reasons don't force that sentence to be true, and I'm not going to buy into that sentence until there's clarification of this core notion of good education that's floating around. Until that's clarified, I don't know what to say about the conclusion. So I am concerned, and I'm not disagreeing with the argument, but I'm not buying it. I don't buy it. I'm not ready to say, yep, that's true. That's right. That's accurate. That maps onto the reality that we all live in. And why am I not yet ready to buy in is because there's significant ambiguity about what counts as a good education. And this argument, does not provide. So, and this argument, specifically, R1 and R4 does not provide enough information to remedy this ambiguity. They just, R1, R4 just mention good education, but they don't tell me what it is. A list of criteria, standards, definition, etc. of the notion of what counts as a good education is needed before I would be willing to accept this argument as plausible. Before I'd be willing to accept this argument. So, that's good enough. Now we go to step 9. The results, this is going to be the same given the context. This is a video for everyone. What does everyone in the class think? Have I been fair to my neighbor's reasoning? Was I charitable enough? Did I, and we would ask these questions ourselves if we're generating our own, our own argument. I don't assume that just because I've rendered it all this way that I got it perfect. I mean, I would have to ask my neighbor, and I'm asking the audience. Y'all can decide. Why does, or what does everyone in the class think? What does everyone in this class think? Yep, I'm getting tired. Have I been fair to my neighbor's reasoning? Was I charitable enough, etc.? And then the results is this video is sharing my analysis of the passage. Yeah, so that's it. That is how to walk in. Now notice, was this laborious, labor intensive? Yes, it is. But the thing about it is we narrowed in on a whole lot of what's potentially lying at the root of why. Like, see, there's a little bit of antagonism with this notion of really, this obviously mattered to the person who articulated these sentences. Well, I know my neighbor. I know that this mattered to that person. And if something matters to someone enough to give you an argument, give their reasoning, you can always assume there's some values underneath it. And so what did we do? We worked, and I had to do some struggling to kind of state the problem. Conflict between one actual value, my neighbor's understanding of what's needed for a good education, and one assumed or projected value, the school's understanding of a good education as evidenced by their recent purchasing behavior and parental request. Yeah, so the idea is that's the value conflict, and what is our determination at the end of the day? Is that this conflict will persist indefinitely until my neighbor is more specific about what he means and thinks a good education entails, as well as we can't assess whether the school is legitimately guilty of squandering money until we understand what their conception of a good education involves. So until my neighbor clarifies it for us, which, that's not going to happen given the context. This is just an example. But the idea, until the person clarifies what he means by good education, and until we talk to, say, the schools themselves, the administrators, the supervisors, the board of education people, until we talk to them and they defined out how they define the value of a good education, and our neighbor defines it out, well then if those two values are similar enough that we can say, well, really they share the same value, then we can ask and actually see if reason one is true or not. But until we know how each party involved in this disagreement is defining what the value of a good education actually has to include or involve, we cannot decide. But now that doesn't mean we know what we would need to do. Like, I would need to go talk to my neighbor, say, what do you really think a good education involves? What does it mean to have one? What are your ideas? And get that. Then we could go to the state where this was done, which is in South Carolina. So the idea is we could talk to supervisors of schools, administrators for the district. We could do that and get a sense of their thoughts about a good education. So that would be the next steps. If we really wanted to evaluate this argument honestly, really wanted to run its course all the way through, that's what we would need to do. In this class, clearly you're not required to go to that level of verification. All you're required to do is just to capture it and identify it. You're not required to do any more than just when your decision, if you agree or disagree, well, then just point to where the ambiguities might lie or what seems especially untrue in a reason. That's what we're doing. But you're always disagreeing with the reasons, like R1, R4. You're never really disagreeing with the conclusion. The conclusion, it don't matter. If the reasons are broken or they're unclear, the conclusion does not matter. So that is how this is done. This video, it's clearly been quite long at this point. So I'm not going to do another one of these passages. I'm going to leave them, that if people want to practice, you have two worked out examples of how to apply the philosophical pattern of inquiry that we will be using throughout the semester. And I would say use this pattern when you're doing your readings, your weekly readings. And now, of course, you don't have to break all this down and turn it into me. All you have to do is do it while you're reading to help yourself make sense of the weekly readings and the assignments. And especially with the discussion, we're going to be practicing parts of this. Like, it seems really laborious when we go through all 10 steps, but keep in mind during weekly discussions, we're just doing a few steps. Like, we may do steps 3 through 7 or so, 3 through 8. And I may not, we may do steps 4, 5, 6, and then 8. We would always do 7. But like, typically, do I expect people to be able to necessarily say it's valid, invalid? Not necessarily. What's most important, though, is that you know this exists. And if you do this step, you will home in on which reasons you actually are concerned about as a reader, as a recipient of the passage. Try to find the reasons that you specifically have concerns about. Or you can always strengthen. If you think someone has a very good argument, point to the strengths of the reasons in this. I've just done 2 where it was like maybe or no, because that tends to be pretty typical. But no, these other passages are interesting. And everyone in here is more than welcome to go through them on their own time. If you have any questions, if you try to work through that process, and you have questions to me about, are you kind of doing this, the way it's most helpful to you to do it, by all means, just send me an email. I'll be glad to look at it. But yeah, there's other passages about harvesting organs from anencephalic babies or gun control. There's 2 one for it, one against it. These arguments are typical ethical moral arguments, but I focused on this one with my neighbor because I think that reveals this is a very difficult passage to make sense of. So I wanted everyone to see what a difficult one looks like. And that's why I also did this one about the weather forecast. This is a relatively simple. Passage 1 is like pretty simple to make sense of. Passage 5 is rough. And we have gone through a simple and a rough so that you get a feel for what it's like. Some of these other passages could be more or less challenging, just depending on, the more you practice, the easier it gets. A few words about extra credit. Yeah, extra credit. If you look at the extra credit, like extra credit 2 and 3, extra credit 1 is still out there, by the way, where you can submit like 3 values and your reasons for why you think those values might need to be added to the values, disvalues list that I gave everybody during week 1. But also, this is the sort of stuff that the extra credit, this will help you tremendously in doing the extra credit. When you start to do it, certainly rewatch this video. And you'll be well prepared to do it if you choose to. Also, this is the final thing I'll say in this video. There's a really helpful book that there's been lots of editions of it. And it's a book that I've used sometimes in my classes. You're not required to use it in this class because, HDTC, they already have a book, the one that we bought and we will be using. But this is just a supplement There are many additions to this. Like I actually have a copy of the 5th edition. This is the 12th. Yeah, this is the 12th edition. Let me add that in. This is the bibliographic information for the 12th edition. That it's not necessary that one buys this, but it is a very helpful book with the words and examples that may help people throughout this semester. It's about $25 on Amazon. If you are interested in checking it out, I would just say go to Amazon, just type in Brown and Keeley, asking the right questions. You will encounter many editions. Like I said, I have the 5th edition of it from 95. This is the 12th edition in 2017. I've looked in the 12th edition. It's essentially just has more information than my old 5th edition has. That just tells you how long I've been in teaching. But the idea is this is a really helpful book for people who are starting out or that have already that are really interested in reasoning and argumentation. It's a helpful book. So by all means, check it out if you want to. What I will do is this will be the Value Laying Argumentation SE. This is going to be the annotated version. That means that this is the version everyone in here will have on hand this week, as well as I'll give you just the top layer version, like what this looked like before I started writing in it. So everyone will have this. They'll have this video as well as a version of this that's not been annotated with all these A, B's, sub A's and stuff. But I hope this video has been helpful. Like I said, it's been a lengthy video, but I do it because I think that it's extremely valuable whenever you encounter a new process or a pattern for someone to actually walk through it and show you how to do it and use it. And keep in mind, I don't expect people to be experts at doing this today, tomorrow, or even by the end of the semester. But I do expect people to kind of practice with it and become better at it. That's the purpose of the class. This is how we achieve a lot of those learning outcomes. This is useful, though. You can use it in everyday life. But I hope this video has been helpful, and I will talk with everyone a little later. Until then.